So we're picking up the 11th chapter of Ketubot. So we're coming to the end of the Mishnah of Ketubot, actually. I think there are 13 chapters in all. And the Mishnah is more or less following the life cycle of a marriage. So it began with, what kind of ketubah different people received when they got married. And it's going to close with death. It's going to close with death and the rights of a widow to, at this point where it's engaged with the rights of the widow to claim her ketubah after the death of her husband. So if you like, we started with marriage and we're ending with death. That's really where we jump in at the beginning of the 11th chapter. Almana nizonet minichsei yitomim. A widow is maintained out of the property of the orphans. So the death we're speaking about here is the death of the husband. So the husband has died. Of course, the widow is due the ketubah. But we've learned already, and we'll actually see this. Maybe we'll see this we learned it in the 4th chapter. Let me just jump quickly to the 4th chapter. Ve'at tien yatva b'veiti umizanta min chasai. Kol yamei megad amrutech b'veiti. You shall live in my house and be maintained from my possessions all the days of your widowhood. In other words, and this is a standard condition of the ketubah, and even if it's not written down in the ketubah, it is assumed, it's a condition of the court that she lives in the house and she's maintained from the possessions of the husband all the days of her widowhood. And actually in Judea, they used to write until the heirs wish to pay you the ketubah. Now, it is assumed, just leaving aside the practice of Yehuda, and let's go back to Jerusalem and Galil. You shall live in my house and be maintained from my possessions all the days of your widowhood. This is until she claims the ketubah. So she actually has a choice. She has a choice. She can live in her husband's house and maintain his affairs, or she can, if you like, leave and claim her money and then leave it to the heirs. That's her choice. So with that in mind, let's go back to our Mishnah. So she's maintained out of the property of the orphans. So at this point, her husband is dead. The property belongs to the orphans, but she's still got the right to be maintained out of it. And there's a quid pro quo, just as she's maintained by the husband. And in return, he owns any kind of income that she creates during the marriage. Same with the orphans. Her handiwork belongs to them. Yeah, she's getting maintenance, but they get any income. But they're not obligated in her burial. Now, that's a really interesting feature. Why aren't they obligated in her burial? Let's keep going in the Mishnah. Yorsheha hayorshin ktubata hayavim b'kvurata. Her heirs who inherit her ketubah are going to be obliged to bury her. Let's think about a situation where the husband has got children from more than one marriage. Now, we've always said that her children, so in other words, his children from her children are going to inherit her ketubah. But her husband's children from other wives are not going to inherit her ketubah. They're not her inheritors. And so Mishnah is just clarifying that in general, she's maintained from the property of all of the inheritors of her husband. But only the heirs who inherit her ketubah are going to be obliged to bury her. And the Bartanura just, he just clarifies that this idea that she's maintained out of the property of her husband as owned by the heirs is either land or movable property. And he actually quotes our Mishnah going back to chapter 4. It's a condition of the Ketubot, you'll live in my house and be supported from my property. So with that in mind, if you like, that is setting the scene. The widow's living in a husband's house, and she's actually managing his property, perhaps. To what extent can she dispose of his property in order to raise funds for her maintenance or to pay off her ketubah? Maybe she needs to sell land to raise money to pay off the ketubah. So the Mishnah continues. Almanah. A widow is the same widow, whether after betrothal or after marriage, may sell without permission from a court. In other words, she can start disposing of her husband's affairs in order to provide for her own maintenance or in order to provide for her own ketubah. And Rabbi Shimon is going to somewhat disagree. We're going to learn from the Rambam. By the way, the halacha doesn't go according to Rabbi Shimon. That's the Rambam's comment on this Mishnah. But ein halacha ka Rabbi Shimon. But let's learn Rabbi Shimon because he makes an interesting. He brings out, if you like, a sensitive. He's sensitive to the language of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said, "Almanah bein mina erusin uvein min hanisuin." This is a widow, whether after betrothal or after marriage. So I think we're pretty much familiar today with the idea that a widow is a widow after marriage. So she goes through the marriage and, they get to some age and her husband dies. And then clearly she's going to dispose of her husband's affairs and sell property either to maintain herself or to get her ketubah. But that's not the only situation we can think about. What about a widow who never married her husband, who was only betrothed to her husband? And I guess, death at maybe in middle age was more common in the time of the Mishnah than it is now. And perhaps the betrothal of a woman to an older man who might run the risk of dying off before the wedding, perhaps that was more common than it is now. So when the Mishnah is talking about almanah, mina erusin, they're talking about a widow who's actually she's never entered her husband's house. She's betrothed to him. So she can't separate from him without a get. And if he dies, she's due the ketubah. But she's never gone into her husband's house. So her status, according to Rabbi Shimon, is slightly different. Rabbi Shimon Omer, mina nisuin mocheret shelo bebeit din. Rabbi Shimon says, after marriage, she can sell without the court. Min ha'erusin, lo timkor ele bebeit din. After betrothal, she can only sell with permission from the Beit Din. And he's going to give a reason. Mipnei she'ein la mazonot. She's not entitled to maintenance. V'chol she'ein la mazonot lo timkor ele bebeit din. What's Rabbi Shimon? And someone who's not entitled, or anyone who's not entitled to maintenance, can only sell with permission from the court. And Rabbi Shimon seems to be making a distinction between, routine sales, which a widow might have to make in order, just for practical purposes, in order to buy clothes. In order to buy clothes, she might have to sell something from her husband's estate. And Rabbi Shimon is agreeing with the first opinion in the Mishnah that it's degrading, it's embarrassing for a widow to have to go to court to say, look, do you agree with my sale of such and such property in order for me to buy clothes for Rosh Hashanah? We can't have that situation. Clearly, the widow who's in possession of a husband, who's in her husband's house, has to be able to dispose of her husband's affairs in order to effect her own maintenance. But what about someone who's not entitled to maintenance? Well, this is the bride whose husband died before marriage. So she is entitled to the ketubah, but she's not entitled to maintenance. And if she needs to sell property, this is a one-off sale. It's a sale of a thing. I mean, remember the ketubah is 200 zuz. It's approximately the rent of a courtyard for a whole year. It's a significant sum. And this is going to be a significant disposal of assets. Rabbi Shimon is saying, okay, for routine asset disposals, we don't need to go to the supervision of a bet din, but for a significant one, actually we do. Actually we do. And halakha doesn't go according to Rabbi Shimon, but the Rambam will comment later on that we're talking here about a bet din of experts. She doesn't need a bet din of experts, but she should nevertheless subject herself to some kind of scrutiny from a bet din hediot, a regular lay bet din, which includes some people who are familiar with property transactions, just so that the heirs of her husband have some confidence that they're not getting cheated.